Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. We'll be starting in just a moment. We'll let the people that are running at the top of the hour to get to their next meeting to join, and we'll start in a second.
Panel webinar. Improving administrators and teachers' decision-making and being SchoolSims.
Again, I'd like to welcome everyone, and thank you for being on time, and we will be starting in just a moment. In the meantime, please feel free to enter your name, where you're coming in from in chat. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible, even though there'll be a lot of talking, but hopefully, answer questions and make this a dialogue, to make this about you. So please feel free to introduce yourselves so you can chat amongst each other as well as with us.
Oh, we can't. We have enough going.
All right, thank you all for sharing. And with that, please feel free to keep going with your sharing who you are, where you're from. And again, I'd like to welcome on behalf of the SchoolSims team, welcome you all. My name is Ken Spiro. I'm the president and co-founder of SchoolSims, and I'm really delighted to have you here at this webinar, the Neuroscience of Simulations, with this wonderful group of panelists who I will be introducing over the course of the webinar. But this has been kind of a long journey for me to get here. I have been doing simulations for it'll be 35 years now, only more recently in K-12. But I have seen, working with audiences around the world across multiple different industries, that simulations work. And really, my operating premise is this idea that experience is the best teacher, right? That's not a surprise, right? We all know that. In fact, from infancy, that's how we learn as human beings. And so the question is that after seeing this in so many different instances, and actually having a business that this is the focus of it, as you can imagine, this is something that the fact that my operating challenge was, why isn't everybody simulating? I don't understand. If we know that experience is the best teacher, and we know from other industries that in fact simulation approximates experience, right? You wouldn't put a pilot in a plane, you wouldn't put a doctor in a patient suite, you wouldn't send folks out in the military without hours and hours and hours of simulation. So why is it that everybody isn't simulating? If this is in fact the way we learn, as we know from how we learn to crawl, how we learn to walk, how we learn to all kinds of things, why isn't everybody simulating? And so I did spend a fair amount of time thinking about this, as you can imagine. And what I came up with is this idea that what's happened in the learning space writ large is that instruction and learning have become synonymous. So we tend to look at everything, pretty much everybody tends to look at learning challenges through an instructional lens. And I don't mean to diminish that in any way, shape, or form. Instruction is very important. There's lots of stuff we don't know. And in fact, there's lots of stuff we don't know that's not particularly interesting. So it needs to be designed in a very compelling way. And that's all great. But the fact is that when you think about how as humans we learn, we do learn from being taught, and we learn from experience, but they're not the same, right? The process of learning when it comes to experience is different than it is from instruction. When it comes to instruction, we learn from we learn from the right way of things, right? We learn this is what you need to know. These are the steps to follow. These are the this is the framework that helps to make this make sense, right? And that's all very important. But life doesn't present that way, right? And when it comes to experience, our best learning opportunities don't come from getting it right. They actually come from getting it wrong. It comes from making mistakes. It comes from failing. And so, whereas you wouldn't design instruction with failure in mind, you have to design experience with failure in mind. And so, on my journey, this was a time at which I designed what I call the experience design methodology, which is a complement to instructional design. But if you're designing experience, you have to design it differently. And so, therefore, let's do that in that way. And was actually invited to teach at the Graduate School of Education in a doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania, in a program for chief learning officers, which was in association with Wharton. And while I was teaching in that class, I was introduced to the Graduate School of Ed mid-career head, Mike Johannick, and we hit it off. I talked about what I was doing in SIM. He shared what he was doing, what he calls a silent crisis of leadership in K-12. And it was just a natural fit, right? The idea of the challenge of decision making when it comes to leadership, and I'll extend leadership to include anybody involved actually in a school, right? You're leading a classroom, leading a department, across whatever the case may be, right? The challenges that are facing folks, especially in today's day and age, right? Everything's unprecedented until it happens, and anybody in education, your days are filled with unprecedented events, whether you're in higher ed or whether you're in K-12, but certainly in the K-12 space. And so the importance of experience, the importance of, is different than maybe flying a plane, right? Which is a procedural sim, right? When it comes to education, we need cognitive sim. We need an opportunity to be able to practice thinking. We need to be able to practice how to think critically, because there isn't 5 steps to follow to be successful when you're leading in a school, when you're leading in a building or leading in a classroom. And so we need to be able to be thoughtful, and that's what we need the experience doing. And so how do we go about doing that? So how do we, this is what brought us here, which is I've observed, for myself, had observed in multiple different contexts, it's not a cultural thing, it's not a geographic thing, it's not an industry thing, it works for everyone around the world. So what is going on with this modality that makes it so powerful? And so really try to start to unpack that, because there is a lot of science, there's a lot of anecdote, but there's a lot of science. And so really it's to connect the dots. And so please, again, I'm inviting everybody to ask questions, challenge, if you will, ask additional things. This is just the beginning of this. I'd like to be able to do more of these because you can't do it all in an hour. But so let's start with this idea that experience is the best teacher. We know that. But when we talk about simulation, what do we mean, right? Because there's obviously in this modality, in this space, there's really no lexicon that says, what a key definition of simulation is. For our purposes, although the concepts apply to all forms of sim, I'm going to be talking specifically, we'll be thinking about and referring to, think of it as an online branching narrative, right? A choose your own adventure. It's delivered from a browser, so it's eminently scalable, and we'll talk more about that. But the idea of making decisions, and then it takes you down a pathway so that you live the consequences and ultimately have the opportunity for reflection and feedback. And it all takes place in a context, right? It's narrative based, so it takes place in something that will look, feel like your own business, right? It takes place in a school, it takes place in a classroom. And these are obviously specifically oriented towards K-12. So in this idea of experience being the best teacher, that's true, but you have to remember it, right? I mean, it has to be a memorable experience. It has to be sticky, right? We have lots of experiences that we forget, right? And we'll talk, actually, I'll jump to the brain research one, right? So John Medina, if you haven't seen this book, it's a wonderful book, Brain Rules. He's a neuroscientist, and his researchers did a lot of research on the brain, and specifically on the issue of how do we get things from short-term to long-term memory, right? That is a very complex procedure in our brains in which we get things to move to something that we actually retain, right? Short-term memory doesn't stick. So, and it's not an easy process to get from one to the next, but one of the key things is emotional engagement. And so one of the things we want to do in a story is we tend to get emotionally engaged. If you've read a book, if you've gone to a movie, if you've seen whatever, even TikTok, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how long it is, but if there's a narrative element, it has the wonderful opportunity, as we know about the power of storytelling. I'd say there's probably no more compelling, powerful engagement tool for any age, anywhere in the world, right? Because we know history we transferred history over the course of time through stories, right? Before there was writing, and even since there was writing. So the opportunity to capture that, to harness that power. Now, from a neuroscience perspective, there have been fMRI studies that looked at the brain when they were doing different things. And when the brains were engaged in kind of facts and figures being communicated, two parts of the brain, two spaces in the brain lit up around language comprehension and processing. And yet when you engaged with a story, when you were under the fMRI, 8 different areas lit up, including touch, movement, scent, sound, color, shape. So in essence, what's happening, what we're seeing is that when you're engaged in a story, when you're reading a story or watching a story, or narrative-based something, we're triggering aspects of the brain that help us to feel that we're there, right? So the opportunity to be present. So this idea of simulating, okay, obviously you're going to get that's going to come through in the theme. We're beginning to see that is an opportunity. Some research I came across at Stanford Graduate School of Business did studies where stories were 22 times more memorable. I don't even know what that means. How did they measure 22 more times? But when dealing with emotion and memory, and they looked at what parts of the brain are impacted by stories, and in fact, they're all related to emotions and leading to longer term memory. And so the opportunity to engage in this kind of activity, okay, so I'm trying to lay the groundwork here, because what we're trying to do ultimately is populate the experience portfolio. What is that? So when we're faced with a decision in our jobs, I would suggest to you, this is not science-based, this is purely fiction on my part, but I think it makes sense. We have somewhere tucked away in our subconscious a portfolio that's filled with our past experiences, right? And when we're facing a decision or facing a situation where we need to make decisions, right, we very, very quickly sift through that portfolio, and that in fact, and glean from it what we can, and that informs our gut, right? That's our gut reaction, happening obviously very quickly. So if we're aspiring to a new job, what happens if our portfolio is empty, right? We're a teacher today, we're aspiring to be a leader, and we don't have any leadership experience. So what then? So we're going to draw from our kind of general portfolio, which may not necessarily lead us down a good path. On the other hand, we may not have, when you get very specific about a particular type of issue, we may not have any experience with that. And so again, we're trying to glean from other things that may or may not be helpful. So how do we populate that experience portfolio without the school of hard knocks? Because that's really rather painful, especially in today's day and age, right? The mistakes can be rather painful. So how do we try to minimize that? We're going to make mistakes. There's no question about that. But how do we populate that portfolio so that we can, in fact, be drawing from, so that our gut reactions are informed, right? They may not be right, but at least they're informed so you can justify them. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is engage, because without engagement, there's nothing. We need to retain the experience that we're having and maybe the lessons that we gleaned from that. But ultimately, we need to be able to retrieve it. And that's the importance of context, the importance of retrieval context, right? So that you're practicing in something that seems similar, so that when you're facing a classroom, when you're in a building, when you're facing stakeholders, parents, other staff, students, whatever the case may be, that it fits, right? That's not fantasy. It's not some other realm of gaming, if you will. That's a different set of processes, but that we can actually retrieve them. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. And that's what we're going to continue to talk about in terms of navigating this continuum from engagement through retrieval, and what is going on that helps to make this a reality. And, ultimately, the thing that we're trying to retrieve is not a specific, it's not procedural, right? It's not do this and you remember to do it this way and it'll be successful for you, right? It's not going to work, right? When you're dealing with the same people, they don't act the same way. And so we need to be able to be thoughtful. And this, to me, is one of my favorite quotes from Viktor Frankl, who was a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. But between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our power to choose. In today's day and age, in our schools, and I keep saying that, and I apologize, but the fact is that there's a lot of heat out there. There's a lot of differences of opinion and deeply held beliefs, more so probably than, I don't know that it was like this decades ago, but it's gotten to a point at which it's putting educators in a very difficult spot because there's a lot of emotional reaction, right? We get angry, we get afraid, we get embarrassed, we get who knows what, right? There's a lot of emotional response. But, and I sometimes joke when I teach, the deer in the headlights rarely goes well for the deer. So how do we create that space? The stimulus is out there, or the stimuli are out there, but we can't just react. We need to validate how we're feeling, take a breath, and then be able to choose. I can't teach you this. The only way we can get better at that, especially if we're an amygdala hijack. So again, from a neuroscience perspective, we know it's fight, flight, or freeze, right? That's a reaction. It's a natural reaction. But how do we just press pause for a minute and not just react? That's only done through experience. And so that's kind of the laying the groundwork. With that, I'd like to introduce our first guest, which is Rich Carr. I met Rich a few years ago at a conference, and thankfully, my presentation followed his. And this was the one time in my life that I saw a presentation that I found so compelling, I rewrote my presentation in the final 10 minutes so that I could actually leverage everything that he had said, because it so well laid the groundwork for what I was going to talk about in SIM, but gave the science behind it. And so we've been in conversation since. And with that, Rich, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. And for that meeting too, I believe it was at Columbia Teachers College. And it actually changed my life in a similar way because of the specific questions you were asking about neuroscience, and specifically how we would look at it as simulations within the things that we do. So for everyone who's joined us, thank you. And I wanted to show you something that I put together specifically for this meeting, because we don't develop Sims. We use them in every presentation we do. And the reason we do that is because I don't look at the audience as anything other than a bunch of brains. So this is the animation I put together to kind of explain, or not kind of explain, to very generally explain how information is moved from short-term memory to a long-term memory by using the brain. Now, of course, all of our senses come through the brain stem, through our different senses and whatnot. And what I'm going to show you here is this animation of how a world without Sims is in your brain. So we have these four, this is again a very general look at your brain, but we have four learning lobes to our brain. And I've highlighted the temporal lobe, which we're all very used to, because this is when we have a sage on the stage and they're up there talking. It's being processed in your temporal lobes. This perspective I'm showing you on screen right now, with the different lobes lighting up in colors, is also a perspective, and it's now attaching to your occipital lobe, where you process visual information. On top of your brain is the parietal lobe, and if everybody took their fingers like this and touched the top of their hand, I would actually be making you use that parietal lobe. And then finally, there's the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, which is what makes us human. And once we get past the amygdala, as Ken was saying earlier, the hijack, we get into this area of the brain. Hopefully we get through that limbic system, these other lobes here where I was talking about. And once we enact the entire brain, we do so through thought, through movement, through visual and audio interpretations, which is everything a simulation is. And it was bewildering that there's a problem that people don't use them. And I actually look at this as a way, like, why should you use Sims or simulations in your learning? And I can break it down to two primary points when you look at the specific brand of neuroscience I use, which is the learning sciences in cognitive neuroscience. And if you look at this opportunity that you have to light up the whole brain versus versus just going into it and trying to hit one lobe, at a time, it seems to me a foregone conclusion that you would absolutely have to use Sims. The two reasons I think you should, Ken spoke of course, but the primary ones I look at are it's an enhanced cognitive engagement. It's not just passive listening, sitting there hoping that you memorize, because I don't rely on memory at all in any of the things we do, because memory is flawed. We rely on understanding, contextual, as Ken was saying, so that you don't forget how to ride a bike, but you might forget what that sprocket is called on the back tire. Those are memory problems. Understanding is what we're going about with everything. So enhanced cognitive engagement is the number one reason we use simulations in all of our presentations. All of our communications include a simulation. Number two is what I think the key point, which is the emotional and psychological reinforcement a simulation adds to the learning environment. Suddenly you might think one way, but a simulation helps you think of it another way. I mean, it's not only metacognitive thinking, it's an emotional involvement in the learning. And that's key, because when this brain that we're using and trying to get people to speak to, and I'll stop the share here for you, Ken, when that brain is lit up like we showed you here, that means all of the signals are firing on this concept that you're trying to make this audience understand. And you're giving them the opportunity to not only put it into context, but to not only get those mistakes, as Ken had said, you get the repetition, you get the practice, you get the visual part of it. I mean, it's everything that is in your brain is wrapped up into a simulation. And that's great, because it captivates the senses, and it is emotional because it's mirroring what's happening in real life. When somebody smiles at you, it's hard not to smile back. Those are mirror neurons. When you see a simulation, you're in the simulation, and those mirror neurons are firing with you. You feel it. This is why we watch movies. This is why TikTok is so popular. The gamers understand this, because you're going to get through here and you can feel these things, these challenges, and be a part of it. And you get these hits. And of course, we can go into dopamine and all the neurotransmitters that happen out of it. But it's not passive learning. And that's what makes it very nice. It's active learning, and it always involves problem solving. So when I look at simulations and why we use them in neuroscience, one of the things I did after I met Ken was started putting together all the reasons we use simulations in our presentations. As we started writing books, we wanted to make sure people had a written record of that. And Ken, with your permission, and this is just a paper we use for when we're teaching people to present in a cognitive way, I actually outlined all the reasons you should use simulations in learning material. And I can share that document if that's good with you.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll put it here in there. This is on my Google Drive. And again, I just put it in here right before I started this presentation, because I got off of another project. But it's imperative that you look at the way simulations light up the whole brain. That would be the short of what I want to say, because everything else is a little bit of here and a little bit of here. And when I am doing any kind of presentation for any kind of audience, I want them thinking that everything I'm presenting at that time is for me right here, right now. Not the teacher, the facilitator, or whatever we call ourselves up in front of the stage, but for the learner, specifically for the learner. And when I say learner, I mean specifically for the brain, because we do have to get past that amygdala hijack, which is the reactive brain. 80% of the time, you're spending yourself reactive. So I want that amygdala going, oh, let this information in. This is good, and it's for you. And if I can take part in it, like with a simulation, I get that enhanced cognitive engagement. I get that emotional and psychological reinforcement. I am, in a sense, greenhoused, because I'm not on the spot, and I get to literally watch how this is done, make mistakes with it, how it's not done, engage it in a way where I can actually anchor it in learning that I have somewhere in my life, like, oh, I've been in that situation, and it's like, oh, I wouldn't handle it that way. Suddenly, I'm a part of the play here, and I'm not just passively sitting back. And I could repeat that in a number of ways, but I wanted to make sure you had the document. I wanted to make sure you saw how a simulation lights up the learning lobes of the brain repeatedly and with ease, because as a learner, you actually get to sit back and not be on the spot because the teacher is sitting there putting something on the chalkboard. I mean, it's just a beautiful escape in the middle as a perspective of a larger learning environment. And neurologically, as far as the cognitive neurosciences are concerned, there's, as you can see, some 13 very solid reasons that have documented why this should be a part of what you do. Oh, good. It did show up there. So Ken, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you so much. And while we're here, just so you all know, Rich has a couple of books, Brain-Centric Design, which he co-authored with his partner, and Surprise, which is just launched. So please feel free to look those up. As it's just more of this wonderful content. And thank you for that, Rich. And as you can see, to me, when I saw this, it was my really kind of one of my first real science-based walkthroughs. Where we hadn't met yet, so he didn't know that, about the way I was thinking about simulation, and yet everything he said made sense to me, and it just gave the science to what I'd seen anecdotally. I really, really, really apologize for this slide. I do think, I'm a carpenter with a hammer in my hand and everything looks like a simulation, but not graphic design. So I apologize. There's so many words on this page. And really what's important to note really is just that, and Rich mentioned this, what's going on in the brain, right? These are the messenger things that are moving things from the various lobes, are the neurochemicals that are being fired. And fundamentally, these are at play when we engage in a simulation. And there's wonderful information by Paul Zak, Z-A-K. He has a book called The Moral Molecule. I think he's at Claremont University now. Actually, he did have a chance to interact with him and use some of his technology, but he actually was wondering, the name of his original article that caught my eye was How Stories Affect the Brain. And what is going on? What is that? What is the mechanism by which we're both, that it causes us to laugh out loud or to cry or to, be so engaged, whether it's a book or whether it's a movie or a television show, whatever? How do we get so connected that it feels that it's so memorable and so compelling? And so he writes about this idea that, obviously there's cortisol is going to be released. That's the stress hormone. That is also, but one of the things that happens, if we're stressed out because we're about to be eaten, right? We get very focused very, very quickly, right? So the idea of opportunity to harness focus, because there's so much going on around us, we've got to be able to focus and stay focused. And so cortisol helps us do that, and being involved in the story, especially with educators, right? It doesn't take much to stress an educator to add that underlying level, to tap into that underlying level of tension that educators feel, because that's their life, right? I don't have to tell you that, but in a positive way, right? And then there's oxytocin, and oxytocin is the bonding chemical, right? It's the love chemical. And the idea of being able to engage in a story and we feel more generous and trusting, this highlights not only the opportunities for engagement, but also when we do it socially, because we are social creatures, right? We engage, we look to be as part of collectives, and the opportunity to not only learn from one's own experience, but from the experience of others, that is enabled through oxytocin. We can't help it, right? So when you're doing sims synchronously, there's an opportunity, but even when you're doing them asynchronously, we have that shared experience and the shared story, and it is the opportunity to connect. And there's wonderful research on mirror neurons that Rich just mentioned, that if people are engaged in the same story, even if they're not connected at all, their brains are aligning. It's a fascinating stuff. There was actually this is Uri Hassan from Princeton University, and there was actually a recent article in I think it was in the Wall Street Journal last year, that really talked to this research on the mirror neurons, and again, mirroring what we're seeing relative to being able to see ourselves in the action, so it actually feels like we're doing it, but also aligning with those we're doing it with. And then obviously dopamine, right? We're getting rewarded, right? We're always looking. We're going to continue to do things that we get rewarded for chemically. And this is what's happening when we're problem solving, when we're engaged in problems of practice in a sim. And then serotonin and endorphins also can be at play. And so the opportunity to engage with this is wonderful from the standpoint of enabling that emotional engagement, because again, we can't help it because it's chemical. But the opportunity to actually engage in even confrontational or difficult conversations. So I will tell you just one quick story. Back early in my career when I was working in corporate, we were doing programs for Ford Motor Company, and they had asked us to do, these were management leadership courses, and they wanted to run a class they wanted to have leadership together with the union leadership. Now, as you know, certainly from the most recent events in the automotive industry, leadership and our management and the unions don't get along. Right? They don't necessarily like each other very much, but they wanted, the company wanted to have these people, especially if they're, engaged in financial management or other kinds of things, that they have to be able to work together. So they wanted to actually have them trained together. Now, what was interesting, this was back in the day when people came in for residential programs, right? Were 3 days long, when people actually, engaged in that kind of activity, which is kind of, I guess, for those of you who weren't around then, I guess this audience, probably everybody was around then. People actually did that, certainly on the corporate side, where they're multi-day events focused on learning, not just a conference. And so we had multiple rounds of simulation. So this was a simulation that transpired as it was blended with the instructional content over the course of 3 days. And so there were several rounds of sim. The first round was predictable. You'd see them standing, standing around. They was in breakout rooms. So we had them, they were back, leaning back, hands crossed, arms crossed their chests, really kind of just, they were there because they had to be there. By the end of the fourth round, they were slapping each other on the back. They were huddled over the computer, engaging in the sim. They were loving it and loving each other. And so it pointed out to me just this opportunity, especially when we're dealing with multiple stakeholders. We recently had one of our lead instructors, Trent Grunmeyer, who used to be at Drake and now he's at Buena Vista University, ran a sim between superintendent and a leadership team and a board, and really had that opportunity to have a shared experience. And again, so the decision, having the experience is one thing, but having that collective, having that opportunity to actually work together in a simulated way, though it's still not real and the stakes are less high, but that's what we're now trying to potentially mirror for the future. And so what's happening in a sim, I just wanted one quick, another distinction I want to make between different forms of sim is they can be oriented towards development versus assessment, right? Many role play type simulations, and again, not in any way to diminish them, but they are more assessment oriented, if for no other reason than because they're difficult to scale, right? You only have so much time if you have actors or you're doing it amongst participants, right? There's only so much time you can do and so many, for each person to engage. So you want to see them do the right thing, not necessarily what they would do. That's where development comes in, right? So there's certainly benefits to that, and also development and opportunities in development, which is where failure is an option. And in fact, failure can be encouraged, right? Take a path. It doesn't, you're not sure what'll happen. Try it out, see what'll happen. Deal with the consequences, deal with the flow of events, because, well, we all make mistakes and you could end up going down a bad path and not even meaning to. So getting some practice with it is not a bad thing. And so when you think about what's happening in a sim, right, we're engaging with the story, right? With the narrative flow, it begins with the narrative and we get hooked in with the cortisol, we get hooked in with the oxytocin. Then we get to points that we need to make decisions. Now, we may feel a little tension. We may not be comfortable with the choices. If we're engaged, it's going to feel real. And we've had, people tell us all the time, oh, my palms started to sweat. My heart rate started to go up. This is all part of that, both the mirroring that's going on, but also that part of emotional engagement. And then when you make the decisions and maybe you feel good, maybe you don't feel so good, right? The opportunity for other chemicals to be firing. Then you're dealing with the consequences, more challenges, because there's no such thing as a one and done, right? So typical scenario-based training is a one and done, right? Or a case study, right? Here's the case, now talk about it. Well, whatever decision you make, something happens after it. There's always blowback. And sometimes the blowback is worse than the decision itself. So how do we get practice with that? And then ultimately, we do need to have that opportunity for reflection, right? Without reflection, experience is really just experience, right? It's not a good teacher, because you need to be able to reflect on what happened in order for it to get to start to get to that point at which now now I have something to remember. Now I see what the critical thinking led me. I see what kinds of things happen both positively and negatively, and have that opportunity. So that's more along the process, what's happening, and the potential insight from neuroscience as far as why it feels good to happen, right? We get plenty of times where, again, back in my early corporate days, when I was younger, people were telling me this was the best training they'd been at in their careers, and they'd been working for longer than I'd been alive. I didn't know what to make of that, other than the fact they've been through some pretty bad training, but it was a fascinating concept to me. And as I began to learn more about this, began to realize why this is in fact the case. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to another friend, colleague we worked with for a number of years. First met him when he was associate superintendent at Prince George's County, when they were part of the Wallace Foundation's Principal Pipeline grant. He went on to be an active member, a senior consultant with Wallace on other grants that they have implemented, and now he's at the University of Maryland. And I am delighted to introduce Doug Anthony. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Glad you're here. Yeah, I'd like to jump in this conversation in two ways to give you some context around my work and at the district level and how SIMS played out there, and then give you context around the current work that I do at the University of Maryland. So I'm not going to read the slide that's on there. So Ken, I'll ask you just to advance us to the next slide. So one of the things that when I started in Prince George's County, and I served in a variety of roles, teacher, principal, acting chief of human resources, a variety of spaces. But when I landed in the space around leadership development, and particularly the work I started to do in concert with the Wallace Foundation's work, we really wanted to be thoughtful about how we developed leaders. And in particular, how did we pay attention to how adults learn? So we started to really grapple with this notion of andragogy and really thinking about how Malcolm Knowles kind of defines this space in terms of what we think is probably really still true and inherently important in terms of how adults learn best. So, you know, I know there's lots of conversations that continue to go on about adult learning theory, but if we just kind of lift it in this space for this moment, I'd like to use kind of his framing around it, because I think it ties in nicely to how we thought about this opportunity we had with developing aspiring leaders in our district. And so Knowles' research talks about the learners need to know, this idea of self-concept of the learner, prior experience, which Rich talked a little bit about as well, of the learner, the readiness to learn, and then the orientation towards learning. And then, of course, how adults are motivated to learn can vary in different instances. And so inside of each of these principles, there are also, as you unpack it, there's this idea around adults really want to learn from one another in particular, and they really want to use their life experiences in that context to learn. They're also very problem-centered, and so they want to have things that are tangible, that they're going to be able to use in real time right away. And then context makes a huge difference, right? So understanding that in these different and unique contexts, things look different. And so appreciation for that is really important. So after we kind of thought through like our approach and thinking about the modalities for teaching and learning, we started to really think about the roles, right? And so the Wallace Foundation afforded us this opportunity to really be intentional about how we grow leaders and how we prepare leaders. And so Grissom's work with Eagle-Eye and Lindsay talk a lot about the complexity of the leader's role and how important principals and assistant principals are in their work to move student achievement. And we understand that that's a difficult task. As a former principal, the role is just unbelievably complex and requires this opportunity to be fluid in thinking. And so what better way to get at these opportunities, these unique contexts, given the different school communities and these situational challenges, than to use simulations. And so when I worked in Prince George's County, it was really important to also consider that we had over 130,000 students, over 20,000 employees, and over 500 administrators, and those who were also aspiring. So how could we calibrate their experience, make their learning public, to give them safe practice in real time? And SIMS afforded that opportunity to us. So on the next slide, we kind of think about what this means at the University of Maryland level. And so at the University of Maryland, we really thought about, again, this idea of the modalities in which we teach, but also as a continuation of how we prepare leaders. So in my current role and in the work of our EDD, we are actually preparing aspiring superintendents. And so the level of complexity and the situational context just grows and grows. And so giving rich experiences inside of what this looks like becomes very important. And so we really look at how we are developing system level thinkers, right? And so the SIMS provides a tool and a way to kind of continue to think about problems outside of one's own sphere of influence while recognizing the system as a whole. And so there's the work of Tony Bright and others around improvement science, and how we actually here ground the students' experience by having them identify a problem of practice. So it not only grounds their research and how they're thinking about it to eventually develop a capstone and also an impact product. And Ken and I actually have been having conversations about how simulations might be used as examples of thinking and work as companion pieces to a student's capstone or dissertation, if you will. But our goal is to really develop leaders who grapple and solve these tough and, as improvement science would say, wicked problems that they both currently face as a district leader and as they may face eventually as a superintendent. So having that system level thinking is a critical aspect of this work. And so our signature element of this work, as I stated, is around improvement science. And we really try to help students think deeply about the systems and the networks of expertise to grapple with these tough problems. Quite often, individuals go into situations and they're doing all the thinking and all the decision making. And that's not a healthy way both to exist and to learn. And so we wanted to really expound on this approach. And so there's 6 principles of improvement science. I won't go through all those, but there are 3 that I like to kind of highlight in context to SIMS. And one is that, again, systems level thinking means that you see the system that produces the current outcomes. And so how do we help individuals both in their current space and as they think broader about the work that they'll do in the future, is helping them understand how that's connected and how those pieces are important. Another principle is around this idea of accelerating learning through network improvement communities. And what's important about this is because simulations provide both a space for individual work and thinking, but it also provides a space for communal work and thinking. And what I appreciate about this is that it ties in nicely to network improvement communities because the goal is to bring experts, both from practice, from research, from the community together to really think through these, again, wicked problems. And then lastly, one of the principles I like to highlight is this idea of a disciplined inquiry to drive improvement, right? So it's really helping the students think through very unique, different ways to get at change ideas that can actually influence the change that they want to see in the work that they're doing. And so SIMS nicely aligns to all of the ways that we're approaching our work. And recently we did an in-depth review of our program, and the feedback that we got from the actual students was that the courses that leverage SIMS and were more integrated were actually seen as more favorable in terms of the effective use of technology and the level of engagement of the students that, as opposed to those courses that did not. And so finally, I'll say, and I love how Rich talked about his perspective and spoke to the what I would call like the advantages and the opportunities with SIMS. And so on this last slide, Ken, I think here are the things that I would want to highlight, particularly both now serving as a practitioner, now more in academics to really kind of position how we're thinking about our course sequencing and the alignment of our problems with opportunities around Sims, one thing I think is really, really important is that making thinking and decision-making explicit. So this idea that you can publicly have these opportunities to engage in these simulations and have students and the learners talk about it, right? It's public, it's communal, there's opportunities for individual reflection and group for reflection. It's a really powerful dynamic. And I love to see the students, their eyes light up and they're having this discourse and this debate around their decision-making process. It's really helpful and is also a very instructional tool for me as the instructor in the room to help make connections, to talk about it in context, to talk about it across different district contexts in the state. Then this idea of immediate feedback. So often practitioners, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? They want to know, they want this kind of immediate, tangible evidence that what they're doing is the right thing. What Sims does is it pulls you back a little bit. It's going to give you some feedback in terms of how you make your decisions. It's not going to give you the answer. It's going to give you an opportunity to kind of think about it. The third thing I have up here is around this idea of inclusivity. I think so often we find in spaces, and in my experience, that decisions are made in isolation. There's no opportunity to think about, have I talked to everybody I need to talk to? Should I go back and talk to this person? Do I need another set of eyes or a different perspective on this particular challenge I'm having? We want to build that kind of leader in our program, one that's collective, one that believes in equity and the intersection of improvement and instruction. And so when we give these opportunities to build this level of inclusivity, when you can do this both in groups and publicly as a class, we find that it helps everyone push their thinking and we can challenge one another in a very safe environment, right? So as I think Ken said earlier, the stakes are a little bit lower than when you're actually out in the district, working through these things. And so lastly, I'll say that it also affords an opportunity to have students continue to reflect that you need evidence, you need research, you need data, and you need additional perspectives to make decisions, particularly those tough problems that come your way. And so how do you account for those things? How do you manage those things? How do you think about those things? And then how do you leverage all the things that we talked about in terms of adult learning to really be informed about decision-making? And so I found Sims to be just so effective on many levels and for many different reasons. And some were even surprisingly great consequences as a result of doing this work. And so I'll leave it at that and be happy to answer any questions later or throughout the presentation. So thanks, Ken. I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you so much, Doug. And I will, everybody, I mean, I know we're coming up on the top of the hour. We'll probably go over, so there will be time for questions, and hopefully people can stay a little bit longer. But please feel free to post questions as you have them, and we will certainly get to them, and we'll try to get there a little bit more quickly. But I did want to highlight, we've mentioned the learning science. Rich mentioned it. In addition to the neuroscience, this is a wonderful article if you have a chance to go to find it. The Decisive Dozen by Will Thalheimer, who's a learning researcher, and really just highlights, there's data, and he highlights, the studies that relate to each of these findings, but just how compelling the learning can actually be, right? So we're talking about the mechanism by which it's happening, but how does it manifest? You can actually improve the learning. You can double it, and there's data to show that's not just a boast. That is something that's real, because these are the kinds of activities that are organic to the simulation process. And so the opportunity to have repetitions, most importantly, the retrieval practice and retrieval context, and then the opportunity for feedback and reflection. Again, you're doubling, you're increasing the opportunity for learning, for processing, and again, in a memorable way so that it's retrievable. It becomes quite compelling. One of the unfortunately, my wife keeps reminding me, right? I'm always out there looking for confirming evidence, right? It's a bias that we see confirming evidence. There's so much confirming evidence. It's anyway. So one of the things that is clear from what Doug was pointing to, and that we observe, especially in the roles of educators, is the importance of confidence, right? The one thing that is so certain about educating is the uncertainty associated with the job, right? Every day, every student, every staff member, everybody has different needs. You're not going to get it right. And you're going to see something, a wicked problem, as Doug referred to, right? There is no easy answer to this. And so we're not going to necessarily have an answer, but we need to feel that we have enough efficacy, self-efficacy, in which to feel like we can go ahead and make decisions. We know we're not going to get it right. We know we're going to learn from that opportunity, but how do we create that space in which people can feel that efficacy as they go out in doing the job? To feel like I need to keep learning, I need to keep improving, but I'm okay where I am and I can actually get out there to do the job. And this was kind of the source of initial conversation I had with Jennifer when we first met, which was she was looking at how do I measure? I wanted to research around self-efficacy and tied into our interest in cognitive load, which I found extremely compelling and was delighted to engage with her in her work at the University of Texas. And with that, Jennifer.
Thanks, Ken. So my name is Jennifer Bailey Waters, actually, too. I'm transitioning I got married last January, and in academia, it's so complicated to transition to a new name. And so I'm still Bailey in a lot of areas, and but Waters as well. And so my work, like Ken shared, I am very much a junior faculty member. I came from the field as a school administrator 3 years ago. So I am in my 4th year as a faculty member. And when I came from the field, of course, we were at the height of the pandemic in 2020, and I was coming in to, start working with our aspiring school leaders, those in principal preparation, and then those pursuing their doctorate, also in educational leadership. And just looking at it from, being reflective and reflexive of thinking, how did I know how to do that? Talking to my students and thinking about things. And that's what got me interested in looking at, just the big overarching question of how do we build schemata, like thinking about that from a leadership perspective of, there is no manual for the principalship. Like you don't get your degree, they give you your keys and the manual comes with it and you know what to do. Like you literally learn on the job. And from what Ken shared, I love, looking at just like the cortisol and the things that kick in, and that does the stress levels and things that impact how you think and what you unpack and what you don't unpack and what you reflect and what you don't reflect upon. And so that's really what took me down my little rabbit trail and ended up crossing pathways with Ken, like he mentioned. And it's really been such just a wonderful experience to get to go into this area and get into the research side of things, but then also just from a practitioner point of what Doug was sharing as well about working with our aspiring leaders and seeing them take this work and grow in their practice. So I'm going to talk briefly about my research first and what that centers around. And so my research is grounded in very much on that practitioner lens, that I am concerned at first and foremost that our leaders are leaving the field at very high rates. And we know the teacher crisis is very, we know that very much from the media, but our leaders are leaving at higher rates than our teachers are actually. And so that's an area that my research is grounded in, because one of the leading reasons around leadership attrition is due to a lack of meaningful professional learning. And so that is what leads me into, kind of my little rabbit hole of looking at how can we do different? How can we prepare our leaders differently? How can we meet our current leaders, our practicing leaders? How can we meet their needs differently? And then also with what Doug was talking about, the other side of looking at the improvement science, from a practitioner standpoint, I was a turnaround school principal. And so that is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And when we look at, looking at the professional development side, professional learning side, also looking at the school improvement outcomes for our school leaders, and those are synergistic, obviously. So when, like I said, my overarching question when I started looking at this was, how do we build schemata? And I started just looking at the research and seeing what was out there about what we were doing in the field when it came to educational leadership. And it led me into, I'm a qualitative researcher, so obviously I look at theory a lot, like that's kind of my frame of where I go first. And so the cognitive load piece came up for me, and I don't want to, for sake of time, get down into all the minutia of what cognitive load is, but I do have the 3 pieces listed out there of intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load. And so in everything that when I utilize SIMS, that's specifically what I make sure I pull through to evaluate that, look at the cognitive load aspect with the SIMS, with my population that I'm doing the studies on. But the main thing is, and a lot of what Doug was talking about, and I wrote so many notes, both with what Rich and Doug were talking about. But, we have to think about, principals, they need the opportunity to practice these complex skills that, the role is very complex. We have to build collective capacity, all of these things that we want to be able to do. And when we're, like I said, there's no manual, when we're going into the job and we're practicing in real time, and we are overburdened and overwhelmed, and you're looking at the loads and what happens in your brain, and then we're not being able to really take away, the complex long-term schemata that we need to have. That's what is impacting in the field. So looking at SIMS in that way and seeing, okay, can we reframe how we are approaching the learning opportunities? And then looking at that from, can we intentionally build a metacognitive playbook, so to speak, through intentional practice by utilizing simulation? And so that was what I was looking at specifically when I started this journey of looking at cognitive load. And so that first article that I wrote was really looking at, in the NASSP bulletin, was looking at the existing research, just a literature review, and then making the argument for that, for this use of simulation. And so, like I said, the studies previous and then ongoing, I continue to, look for and test the intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load. And we use SchoolSims. And I have been fortunate. I was at UT Arlington, and now I'm at UT Tyler. I made the move over, come back closer to home in East Texas. And that every time we have, through all of my research studies, they have all tested. This has been consistent through each one. So the intrinsic load, it has been high. Extraneous load, it has been appropriate, which means that the SIMS are designed well. And then the germane load is high, which means that the value is added through engagement in the SIMS. And so those are all good things. That's what we want to see. And then my other additional areas of focus is obviously self-efficacy, like Ken talked about. That was also what I was looking at. And specifically, I look at when we look at all of the areas that we have to juggle our balls, organization, instructional leadership, resource management, all the different pieces. That's what I'm testing and looking at through self-efficacy. And then synchronous versus asynchronous engagement, again, touching back on what Doug was talking about with building collective capacity, is also important. So that's where I am at there. Sorry, my mouth is very dry. And then just pedagogically, the other piece with that is looking from an instructional perspective of, just a practitioner and working with my students, moving from theory to practice, like Doug said. Also, the other thing that is interesting to me that I wanted to provide, kind of leveling the playing field, so to speak, of providing opportunity for equity and access for our pre-service leaders. Across the nation, every state has different opportunities for practicum or internship experiences within their state programming from the university perspective. But in Texas specifically, we do have practicum hours, and those are housed within their schools and then their mentorship. And they are, depending on what they're provided at their school, that their mentor gives them access to. And so providing simulation through our learning opportunities also provides some more equity and access for them in those opportunities to learn things that they may not get in their different schools and from their mentors. And so that was just a different perspective as well that I look at in approaching that. And then, of course, the reflective and reflexive practice, which Ken talked about this earlier, but I love John Dewey's quote about that we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And that is very critical. That's also part of why in my research where I have really shifted more heavily into looking at the synchronous versus asynchronous engagement and having those variables to, definitely looking at also the impact on self-efficacy with that, and looking at collective capacity and building those skill set for our leaders. And that, we do want to build that inclusivity, not just making decisions as a silo, but then thinking about that from a self-efficacy standpoint as well for them. And then the student reflections, I don't have time for, but that's on the next slide. And I just have a framework of a triad that I had there, where it's just situational awareness, spatial awareness, and identity awareness. These are from focus groups. And like I said, I'm a qualitative researcher. I do mixed methods because obviously we need the data points out of the cognitive load and the self-efficacy pieces. But I do get to lean into the focus group side to make my qualitative researcher side happy. And so my focus group pieces, I pull from that. But the three-dimensional framework and looking at these are the areas that have really developed forward, and also pull back into what Doug was talking about in building that collective capacity. When I talk about these, that actually is very connected into that space. And so helping the students really see themselves from that 360 perspective, and understanding how to navigate things through, working together and not just being alone, and then also developing their leadership identity, and then their identity as a culture on their campus or in their district, and not just, again, being, kind of that Lone Ranger mentality when they're approaching decision making. So that is it, because I know I am out of time and we are over time. So.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And for those of you who need to jump or have already jumped, we will send out the recording. So hopefully this will continue to be captured, and we will be able to share it. But thank you so much for that, Jennifer. And I'll come back to actually that three-dimensional learning in a second. But this is just, this is from my past on the corporate side, but this idea of, ultimately what we need to do is we want to retard the normal forgetting curve, right? And, we can convey all kinds of information and we forget it even faster than we conveyed it. So the idea of spaced learning, but more importantly, this reactivation and the power of the narrative, the power of stories, the power of is in the reflection on the one hand, but then, educators like to talk education, right? They want to continue to share their stories, their experiences. And every time they do that, giving them the wherewithal, as was talked to by both Doug and Jennifer, in terms of the collective, that opportunity to reactivate is continuous. And so the opportunity to further the learning is quite compelling. The one thing I don't want to jump to the end without speaking to this, so forgive me. But this is, in the continuum of experience, it's a pretty broad space. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Sarah Dexter at UVA wrote a paper and done research around the missing middle, which is, the space in between instruction to, being on the job. And that is it is a continuum. There's a variety of things you can go from case studies through various forms of sim, through shadowing, etc. And they're all important. These are not competitive, right? It's not that you do one or the other, right? They're all important because every experience we have is compelling. But I did want to distinguish a little bit between role plays, traditional role plays, immersion, for those of you familiar with that, and our form of sim, which is the importance of actually combining the modalities, right? When we talk about that idea of the experience portfolio, when you're facing especially if you're aspiring to a role and you're in a role play and you're faced with dealing with a gnarly, a wicked problem that you've never faced before, what are you drawing upon, right? You're going to draw on something, right? You may panic and you may get into amygdala hijack and just don't know what you'll do. But if you're drawing from anything, if that experience portfolio is empty, then the insight that you're going to be drawing from in terms of the experience that you're going to have may be limited, right? On the other hand, if you have experiences to draw from that you're sifting through, this is different. But what am I drawing from to make more informed decisions so that that experience is actually has potential for greater impact and learning? There's an opportunity to combine, to do the scalable sims, to populate the experience portfolio, but then be faced with that really, really, really angry parent that there's no replacing sitting across from another person, if that's in fact what you're able to do, and be able to combine the modalities from that perspective. But this modality gives us the further flexibility of capturing the flow of time, because there's never such a thing, as I mentioned, as a one and done, right? These things continue. You make the decision, there's blowback. When you're having this social interaction with somebody, well, as soon as you leave that room, something else is going on, because you need to have that systems thinking orientation that Doug mentioned, right? You need to understand that there's a system at play while you're focused on this one person, and there are going to be consequences of whatever decision you make here, there. And so being able to see, and this was in Jennifer's feedback as well, in terms of being able to see that spatial awareness, being able to see the place of, but in a broader context, so that you're prepared for what's coming, that is a critical element. And the last piece that I wanted to just address, because often this comes up, people, the idea of the role plays is compelling because you're faced with, you're open-ended versus having being able to choose from multiple choice kinds of responses. And I found this research to be fascinating on the power of constraints, or theory of choice, right? So this is from Sheena Iyengar at Columbia University. But ever since the 90s, social psychologists have known surprising truth. If you want to maximize someone's satisfaction with a choice, don't give them unlimited options. Instead, you should give them some choice, but with clear constraints. This added structure is crucial for making your choice, but with confidence. Comes back to that self-efficacy piece. The importance of being able to do this, the research that's been done about brainstorming, that when you open-ended brainstorm, if you've got all the information, then you can make a decision. But we're never in a situation where we have all the information. And so we're going to have to be able to choose. But is it better to choose from a clean sheet of paper, or is it actually better to knock up against choices where we've got recourse, we've got agency, but it's constrained? And that provokes that critical thinking opportunity where we're going to push up against, maybe we want to do something different, but then we think about why. And it drives that critical thinking. And again, that opportunity within the experience to enhance the opportunity for reflection, to extrapolate to your situation, and to have the added confidence that, okay, I see how I need to approach these kinds of things so that when I do have to face them, I can do it in a more prepared way. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending. This, to me, has been very cathartic to finally get this information out. And I look forward to hopefully having additional sessions like this. I had wanted to actually open up a sim, but actually I think maybe we'll share one with the recording for those of you who have not experienced the sim before, just to get a sense of what one looks like, or at least a preview. And with that, I'll open up to questions. If anybody has additional questions for me, for any of the panelists, for all of us, please open it up. Actually, before I do that, they're flexible. This is the library. Contact information. I'll come back to this slide. If anybody's interested in learning more, we'd love to talk to you about simulations. So please, you can just use the QR code to reach out to us, and very much look forward to engaging. And I'll go back to the contact slide so you can reach out to any one of us if you have further questions. But any questions now from the audience, please. We were very clear, guys. There's no mystery.
Ken,
Yes.
it's Erin Murray, and I'm from the
Erin.
University of Connecticut and oversee the principal preparation program. We've been using SchoolSims in our program for the last 2 academic years, and the power that it has played in that missing middle piece that Ken spoke about has been really tremendous. What we're seeing even more and more is the drive and the desire to have more. We have one SchoolSims embedded in each of our courses, but what Rick said, Doug said, Jennifer said, really validates the depth of learning, of real life opportunity. The way that the students, pat each other on the back and look at each other like I've never seen that before. I never heard I would answer a question that way. What we have found now with 2 solid years of this is that we find 3 principal prep leaders doing the simulations has been extremely powerful. And I wonder if that's been a common reference point. We've done them a variety of different ways, but boy, when you put 3 eager principals together, it really has made a difference. Is that continue to be something that you see across your situations?
Did you want somebody specific to answer that, Erin? Or were you directing that at somebody in particular?
Well, I'm thinking of Doug and Jennifer in their work both at Maryland and in Texas. If you hear feedback from students and what they see as the power of doing it alone versus doing it in a trio.
Yeah, I'll share. I've actually, because I just started doing it with research and getting to see the difference with asynchronous and synchronous. And then I've also do it synchronous and asynchronously with my classes. So our institution, I don't run any of my research with my own students. And obviously, for good IRB reasons for that. And so I don't use my own students for my research, but I observe them with what you're saying with that. But I've seen it on both ends of it, just from a researcher lens and a teacher lens. My students love when I give them the option if they want to do it synchronously or asynchronously, because our program is 100% asynchronous online. And so I do not force them because of their schedules and other outside obligations that they have. But I do have a large number who will elect to do it synchronously. And I have to me, I think what I heard you saying is having a group of 3 is where you felt like your power group was together. And I would say that too. I've seen 3 to 5 be my kind of like your sweet spot, is where I've seen the best conversations go together. And I actually follow the same format that David does, because I learned that from him and what he models for Ken when he does the trainings. And so I utilize a mixed method of, doing like the poll everywhere and then having them do discussions and coming up with the collaboration piece. But then we debrief overall at the end, and they just love it. And then they make the other group jealous because they share the people who do it asynchronously. They're jealous and they're like, well, maybe they feel peer pressured to come and do it, with the group the next time, and they figure it out in their schedule. So that's a good kind of peer pressure. But I have seen it too, in just the emergent aspect with my research, that the scores are higher in the self-efficacy, and that's off the, obviously I don't have any complete outcomes of huge data sets yet, but I'm just starting to do that, and I am seeing a higher impact on the scores and self-efficacy with the synchronous groups. than in the asynchronous course.
Yeah, I won't add too much to what Jennifer shared. I think 3 to 5 is the sweet spot. So Fridays we're asynchronous, and then Saturdays we're face to face. So a lot of times I'll give the asynchronous work they do independently, and then we may unpack it in the morning, and then in the afternoon on the Saturday we do one together. And what I'm finding is there's so much power when I mix up the groups, and they're principals, they're directors, and so yeah, I think that, Aaron, that's a sweet spot for me as well. 3 to 5 seems to be the right combination of folks.
Thank you all. Any other questions? Okay. Well, with that, thank you all very much for attending, for sticking with it. And I want to thank our panel. You guys were great, and the work that you're doing and the research that you're doing are wonderful. I look forward to the opportunity to continue to engage with you all. And anybody else out there, by the way, interested in research, if that's your driver. You know, one of the other aspects of certainly in this space is evidence is required, but the modality is still relatively young. There are not a lot of opportunities to do sim. There's not a lot of players. So if anybody's interested in exploring research opportunities, please let us know, because we are very interested in enabling research through Sims if that is an appropriate tool. So with that, thank you all, and we'll hope to see you. And again, it begs if anybody has an answer for why you're not simulating, feel free to share. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.